Trapped in an alien prison with two colossal beasts of steel blue scales and burning amber eyes, a lone human dares to defy his captors. When the moment comes, the walls will shatter, chains will break, and the hunt will begin under a blood-red sky. But in a world where every shadow hides danger, can he trust the creatures who share his escape, or will freedom come at a deadly price? You are new to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel, and like the video, and tell us where are you watching from? Now, let's jump into the story. In the dim blue light of the alien detention hall, Darren sat on the edge of a cold stone bench. His hands gripped the iron bars in front of him, feeling the chill of the metal seep into his skin. Beyond the bars stretched a vast chamber, its high ceilings lost in shadow, and its floor lined with rows of identical cells. Each cell held prisoners from distant worlds, but Darren's was different. His cell had two other occupants, and they were unlike anything he had seen before. On his left and right stood the Silvrex, massive creatures with scales the color of burnished steel. Their eyes glowed like molten amber in the pale light, unblinking, and fixed on the shadows beyond. The aliens who had placed them here claimed the beasts were dangerous, but fully under control. Yet Darren could see something else in their gaze. A sharpness, a spark of thought. These were not mindless animals. They were prisoners too. Darren was the last human in this corner of the galaxy. Captured months ago, he had been brought to this barren outpost after a relentless chase through the void. The aliens who caught him called themselves the Vareth. They studied him like a rare insect, fascinated by his mix of weakness and endurance. They laughed at his small size, at the limits of his strength, but they could not understand how a human could survive so much loss and still refuse to give in. His days passed in silence. He had learned quickly that the Vareth disliked silence. Their culture thrived on constant words, contracts, and spoken agreements. To them, his refusal to speak was unsettling. It was a small way to push back, a quiet defiance that cost him nothing but unnerved them. Every moment Darren spent in the cell, he watched. He watched the guards who marched past on predictable routes. He counted the seconds between the buzzing of the energy locks. He marked how the lights above brightened and dimmed in rhythm with the outpost's artificial day and night. Most importantly, he noticed a tiny flicker in the power grid each night cycle. It was barely visible, a tremor in the light, but it was there. And it could be the key to something more. The Silvrex seemed to notice him as much as he noticed them. Sometimes he would turn and find one staring at him with an expression he could not name. It was not hunger. It was not pure hostility either. There was a strange stillness in those moments, as if the beast were waiting to see what he would do. The Vareth believed they had tamed the Silvrex through implanted control devices and chains as thick as a man's arm. Darren doubted it. He had seen the way their muscles tensed when guards approached too closely. He had seen the flare of heat ripple across their scales when the energy field at the cell door sparked. The creatures were patient, but patience did not mean surrender. He had no illusions about his situation. Escape would be dangerous, almost impossible. But Darren had stopped thinking like a captive a long time ago. In his mind, he was a scout waiting for the right moment. And he knew that if he could move, if he could break free even for a few seconds, he would need the Silvrex with him. Alone, he might get a few steps before the guards cut him down. With them, the odds shifted, even if only slightly. Hours passed. In the stale air of the detention hall, the sounds of alien machinery droned in the distance. Somewhere far down the corridor, another prisoner cried out, only to be silenced by the hum of a shock device. The Silvrex did not move, except for the slow rise and fall of their breathing. Darren shifted his grip on the bars and let his eyes drift to the far end of the hall. The cell doors there were massive slabs of reinforced alloy designed to keep anything from leaving. But every lock had a flaw. Every wall had a weakness. He only had to find it. The guard on the evening watch passed by. His steps echoed in the chamber, sharp and hollow. Darren lowered his gaze, pretending not to notice. The Silvrex followed the guard with their eyes, their heads turning in perfect unison. The guard did not see it. When the alien was gone, Darren glanced left. The Silvrex closest to him was already looking back. They locked eyes. There was no sound, no movement, but something passed between them. A recognition of shared captivity. A faint understanding. He did not know what the Silvrex thought of him. He did not know if they would fight beside him, or turn on him the first chance they had, but he felt certain of one thing. If he waited long enough and moved at the right moment, they would all have a chance to see the other side of these walls. The hum of the lights softened as the artificial night cycle began. The faint flicker he had noticed before brushed across the ceiling. It was subtle, so slight that anyone else would have missed it. Darren noticed. The Silvrex beside him shifted slightly, its claws scraping the floor. Darren leaned back against the bench. He was patient. Patience was survival here. And he had survived longer than they ever expected. As the cell settled into its quiet rhythm, he knew the moment was coming. He could almost feel it in the air. When it came, he would be ready. And maybe, just maybe, the Silvrex would be ready too. The cell was quiet, except for the faint hum of the energy field. Darren sat still on the stone bench, his eyes fixed on the floor. He could feel the Silvrex presence on either side of him, their steady breathing blending with the low vibration of the alien systems. The silence was broken by a sudden crackle from a hidden speaker above the cell. A voice spoke. It was Norvik, the lead Verith scientist. His tone was sharp and cold, dripping with the kind of amusement that only came from control. Human, your stubborn silence serves no purpose, Norvik said. We know your kind, weak in body, restless in mind. Yet somehow you endure. The voice paused before adding, and these beasts beside you should have torn you apart. Yet, here you are, still breathing. Darren did not answer. He kept his eyes on the ground, letting the silence stretch. The Verith despised silence. Their culture demanded constant speech, constant acknowledgement. To them, refusing to speak was an insult. And Darren used that as his only weapon. The speaker hissed again. You think defiance will change anything? The Silvrex obey because we have made them obedient. Their instincts are gone. Their strength is ours to command. Norvak's words echoed off the cold walls. Darren slowly lifted his head. His gaze shifted to the Silvrex on his left. The creature's amber eyes met his. There was something in that look, something alive. Chains rattled faintly as the beast shifted its weight. But it did not move toward him. Instead, it looked past the bars into the hall, as if it too was listening for something beyond Norvak's voice. The hours dragged on. The artificial day faded into night as the lights in the detention hall dimmed. Darren's mind was alert, counting down the moments to the one thing he had been waiting for. The flicker. The brief interruption in the power grid. When it came, it was almost invisible. The faintest dip in the glow of the overhead lights. In that instant, Darren moved. He reached under the thin bedding on his cot and pulled free a small panel he had worked loose days ago. Behind it, a cluster of wires pulsed faintly with energy. His fingers moved quickly, twisting two strands together. A sharp spark jumped from the connection. The cell's energy lock flickered. The bars rattled as the magnetic seal failed. With a heavy metallic clank, the door released. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. The Silvrex stood motionless, their massive heads turned toward the open space. Then the Silvrek on Darren's right lunged forward, slamming its body into the bars. The weakened frame buckled under the force, snapping loose from its anchors. The second Silvrek followed, pulling free from its restraints, with a burst of raw strength that shattered the chains like brittle twigs. Alarms erupted, filling the hall with a wailing tone. Bright light flooded the corridor as armored Varith. Guards poured in from both ends. Their plasma rifles crackled to life, casting blue light over the metal floor. The first guard raised his weapon, but he never got the shot off. The leading Silvrek closed the distance in a single leap, its claws slicing through armor like cloth. The second Silvrek roared, the sound rattling the air and shaking the walls, then charged into the other side of the line. Energy bolts streaked across the hall, striking the Silvreks and leaving scorch marks on their scales. The beasts barely slowed. They moved with lethal precision, their tails sweeping through the guards, knocking them from their feet. Darren kept low, staying behind the chaos. He knew every turn of this detention hall. He had memorized the corridors, the blind spots, the positions of each checkpoint. The Silvreks tore through the guards, clearing his path. He slipped out of the cell and ran toward the far end of the chamber. More alarms blared above him. The sound of boots and the harsh hiss of alien voices echoed from the adjoining passages. Bright flash lit the corner of his vision. One of the Silvreks had smashed an energy shield generator, sending arcs of blue fire leaping into the air. A guard stumbled backward into the crackling field, falling with a shout. Darren darted around a corner and pressed himself against the wall. The Silvreks moved with surprising awareness, staying between him and the lines of fire. They were not protecting him out of loyalty, he knew, but their own fight for freedom ran parallel to his. And right now, that was enough. Ahead loomed the main gate. It was a massive structure of alloy and reinforced energy barriers. Darren's heart pounded. If they could not break through, the entire escape would collapse here. The Silvreks closed. In behind him, their bodies coiled and tense. The larger of the two let out a deep growl, its breath steaming in the cold air. The smaller stepped forward, claws scraping against the floor as if testing the surface. Guards poured into the space from elevated platforms, their weapons trained on the three escapees. The gate's defense systems whirred to life, energy patterns, forming a shimmering wall between the prisoners and the open world beyond. Darren glanced at the Silvreks. This was the moment that would decide everything. Either the creatures would strike against the barrier with him, or they would turn away. The larger Silvrek stepped forward, lowering its head until its jaws almost touched the ground. Its eyes burned bright in the shadows. Darren could feel the air around it heat up. Then the beast moved. The larger Silvrek pressed its body against the fortified gate. Its scales began to shift in color, darkening at the edges and glowing faintly at the center. The heat radiating from the creature was intense, enough to make the air shimmer. Darren stepped back, shielding his eyes from the brightness. The metal groaned as if it could sense what was coming. With a sudden surge, the Silvrek released a wave of searing energy from deep within its body. The gate's alloy frame warped and bent under the heat. The glowing lines of the energy barrier flickering and then collapsing in bursts of blue sparks. The smaller Silvrek wasted no time. It slammed into the weakened frame with all its strength, the impact sending a shock through the ground. The gate buckled and tore free from its mounts, crashing to the floor with a sound that echoed across the detention hall. Freedom stood beyond the opening. The barren plains stretched far under a crimson-tinged sky. Alien stars gleamed in unfamiliar patterns overhead. Darren's heart pounded as he stepped through the shattered entrance. The night air hit his face, cold and sharp after months of the stale air inside the prison. The Silvreks moved beside him, their massive forms silhouetted against the blood-red horizon. For a moment, they stood still, as if testing the air. The glow from the prism lights faded behind them. But Darren knew it was not over. The Verith would come. They would send hunters. He glanced at the Silvrix, wondering what they would do now. They were no longer chained, no longer bound by the prison walls. They could vanish into the night, leaving him alone in a world he did not know. But they did not leave. They stayed at his side, silent and watchful, as though waiting to see what he would choose next. A faint hum carried on the wind. Darren froze. The sound was low at first, but it grew steadily louder. He turned his head and saw a dark shape in the distance, lights pulsing in a slow rhythm. A scout vessel. It was already searching. Darren's mind raced. The planes offered no cover. If the vessel spotted them, the Verith would send ground units. They had minutes at best. "We need to move," he said quietly, unsure if the Silvrix understood his words. The larger Silvrix started forward at a swift, ground-covering pace. The smaller one followed, and Darren kept between them, running across the uneven terrain. The ground was dry and cracked, littered with jagged rocks and patches of strange black vegetation that crumbled underfoot. The hum of the vessel grew sharper. Bright beams of white light began to sweep over the ground in wide arcs. The Silvrix adjusted their pace, shifting to avoid the light's path. Their movements were surprisingly quiet for creatures of their size, their massive frames slipping. In and out of shadow dot ahead, the land began to rise. The jagged edge of a canyon came into view, its depths hidden in darkness. Darren slowed near the edge, looking for another path, but there was none. The vessel's lights were closer now. There, glow reflecting faintly off the canyon wall. The Silvrix paused. The larger one looked down into the canyon, its head tilting slightly as if measuring the distance. Then it stepped back, muscles tensing. Darren realized what it meant to do. Before he could react, the creature roared, a sound rolling through the night like a thunderclap. The roar echoed off the canyon walls, filling the air with a deep vibration. Without hesitation, the Silvrix leapt from the cliff's edge, its wings snapping open in a sudden rush of air. The smaller Silvrix followed, casting one last glance at Darren before disappearing into the darkness below. Darren's pulse raced. He had no choice. He ran forward and threw himself into the open air. The cold wind tore at him, spinning him into the canyon's shadow. Then he felt it, the solid, smooth warmth of scales beneath him. The larger Silvrix had caught him, steady. And sure in its descent, the creature banked sharply, gliding along the canyon wall with a grace that seemed impossible for its size. The smaller Silvrix followed close behind. Above, the beams from the scout vessel swept the canyon rim. Unable to reach the depths below, as they descended further, the air grew warmer and damp. A faint glow appeared ahead, coming from a cluster of bioluminescent plants clinging to the rock. The Silvrix landed gently on a flat section of canyon floor. Darren slid down from its back, his legs unsteady from the drop and the adrenaline. The Silvrix stood close, their bodies blocking him. From the open path, one lowered its head, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Darren met its gaze. There was no threat in the look. It was a question. A test. He reached out, placing his hand lightly on the creature's neck. The scales were warm and rough under his palm. The Silvrix made a low sound, almost like a deep breath. Above them, the faint hum of the scout vessel faded into the distance. For now, they were hidden. But Darren knew the Verith would not stop. This was only the first step. The real test of survival lay ahead in the wild expanse of this alien world. The Silvrix shifted, scanning the shadows around them. They were free now, truly free. Yet they had not left him. Whether it was chance, instinct, or something more, they remained. And for the first time since his capture, Darren felt the possibility that he might not face this world alone. The silence in the canyon was deep, broken only by the slow breaths of the two Silveriks. Darren stood between them, his back pressed against the rough wall, listening to the faint echo of wind moving through unseen gaps in the stone. He could still feel the thundering rush of their leap from the canyon rim, the way the air had seemed to vanish as they dropped into shadow. Above them, the crimson-tinted sky was gone, replaced by jagged walls that blocked out the light. The larger Silverik turned its head toward the distant sound of engines. Darren heard it too, faint but steady. The Varith were not giving up. The noise grew louder, bouncing off the canyon walls in strange patterns, making it hard to tell from which direction it came. The smaller Silverik stepped forward, its claws scraping against the rock. It moved with slow, deliberate steps, pausing, often to listen. Darren followed, keeping his head low and eyes scanning the darkness for movement. They came to a narrow bend in the canyon. A ribbon of pale light spilled across the ground from an opening in the rock wall. The larger Silverik lowered its head, sniffing the air, then moved toward it. The opening was just wide enough for them to pass through one at a time. Darren hesitated, glancing back toward the canyon's open stretch. In the distance, a faint beam of white light swept across the walls. The Varith scouts were closing in dot, without another thought. Darren followed the Silveriks into the passage. The air inside was warmer and damp, carrying the scent of earth and stone. As they moved deeper, the narrow passage widened into a vast underground cavern. It was unlike anything Darren had seen. The walls glowed faintly with clusters of bioluminescent plants, their light reflecting off a slow-moving underground river that wound through the chamber. The water's surface shimmered in shades of green and blue, casting shifting patterns. Across the ceiling, the Silveriks paused near the river's edge. The larger one bent its head to drink, while the smaller stood watch, its eyes never leaving the shadows. Darren crouched beside them, dipping his hands into the cool water. It was fresh, clean, and for the first time since his capture, he drank. Without fear, he sat back on the smooth rock and looked around the cavern. There were ledges high up on the walls, dark openings that might lead deeper into the ground. This place could be a refuge, hidden from the eyes of the Varith. But it could also be a trap if the scouts found the entrance. The sound of distant engines echoed again, fainter now but still present. The Varith would not stop searching. Darren knew they would track the roar of the Silverik to this canyon and sweep every path they could find. He turned to the Silveriks. "We cannot stay near the entrance," he said softly. He did not expect them to understand the words, but the tone and urgency carried across. The larger Silverik lifted its head, water dripping from its jaws, and looked at him for a long moment. Then it moved toward one of the dark ledges high on the cavern wall. The smaller Silverik followed. Darren climbed after them, his fingers gripping rough stone. The climb was steep, but the creatures moved with ease, their claws finding holds in the narrow cracks. When they reached the ledge, Darren saw another tunnel leading away from the cavern. This tunnel was different. The air here was cooler and drier. Faint streaks of light came from glowing veins of crystal embedded in the walls. The path wound upward, and Darren felt the change in the air pressure. They were climbing toward the surface, but not toward the same canyon they had left. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened onto a cliffside, overlooking a vast, open plain. The sky above was darker now, the crimson glow replaced by the deep indigo of night. Strange constellations glittered above them, stars shaped into patterns no human chart had ever named. The Silveriks stepped forward, their bodies outlined against the starlight. Darren joined them, the wind tugging at his clothes and carrying the scent of distant rain. The world stretched far in every direction, empty and wild. He realized this was more than escape from the prison. This was entry into a land where survival would depend on every choice, every instinct. The Verith would not stop hunting. The land itself might be just as dangerous. But for the first time, Darren felt something more than fear. He felt possibility. The larger Silvrek turned its head toward him, its glowing eyes steady and unreadable. It stepped closer, lowering its head until its muzzle was inches from his chest. Darren did not move. For a long moment, they stood like that. Then the Silvrek nudged him gently. A small but unmistakable sign that the smaller Silvrek gave a low sound that carried through the quiet air. Together, the three of them looked out over the plain far behind them. The glow of the Verith outpost was no longer visible. Ahead lay open ground, hidden valleys, and whatever dangers this world held. They would face it together, not as prisoner and beasts, but as allies born from chains and shadow. Without another word, they stepped forward into the night. Each step carried them farther from the walls that once held them, and closer to the unknown future waiting beyond the horizon.